The release of Dissidia NT is almost upon us, people, and although over here in the West we have to wait slightly longer to get our grubby mitts on it than those over in Japan, we're still starting 2018 off with a big Final Fantasy shaped bang. Now, Dissidia NT is of course the latest game to come out of the Dissidia sub-franchise, which was created to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Final Fantasy franchise. This time around, Dissidia NT is also arriving to celebrate a milestone, the franchise's 30th anniversary, and because of that we've got new characters, new mechanics, and a completely new staff and development team working on the game. It means the experience, while still being similar at its core, promises to be quite different from what we saw with the original Dissidia and also Dissidia Duodecim, which released a few years after the original. So, while you're attempting to recover from whatever shenanigans you got up to over the holiday season, why not sit back in a comfortable chair with a nice beverage and relax, while we run through 8 reasons why you should be completely hyped about the impending release of Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. Okay, so our first reason is that Dissidia NT is being released on a home console. Ever since the original Dissidia released back in 2008 on the PlayStation Portable, there were always question marks about how good the game could have been if they just decided to release it on home consoles instead. It could have had much better graphics and overall presentation, while also featuring a more intuitive control scheme due to the expanded array of buttons and the dual analog sticks. With Dissidia Duodecim also releasing on the PlayStation Portable, the desire for a home console version of Dissidia just remained, and when a new iteration was announced for arcades in early 2015 at the Japanese Amusement Expo, we were finally given a glimpse of how good it could look with much higher hardware specifications. A few months later, during a big event to showcase this new Dissidia game properly, it was then revealed that they were developing the game using the PlayStation 4's core system of technology, and that the arcade cabinet would even feature a modified PS4 controller. It gave us significant hope that a home console version of Dissidia was indeed in the pipeline at Square Enix, but despite numerous teasers, we had to wait until E3 2017, almost 2 years after its arcade launch, until it was officially announced to the world under the moniker of Dissidia Final Fantasy NT, which, for your reference, stands for New Tale. Although, as a fun fact here, they also shared in an interview with Famitsu that it was originally called Dissidia NT for a much more basic reason. They're the initials of the game's creative producer, Tetsuya Nomura, or Nomura Tetsuya as he would be referred to in Japan. Next up, we have Takeharu Ishimoto, who's the composer on Dissidia NT. Now, although Ishimoto has literally just resigned from Square Enix, he actually started his musical career at Square back in 1999 and initially worked as a synth programmer. And after working on soundtracks such as Legend of Mana, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy X in this role as a synth programmer, he was given the opportunity to work as a composer on the original soundtrack for what would be the first part of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, Before Crisis. Now, I appreciate that all this might seem pretty redundant information in the context of Dissidia NT, but there is a point to this. Following on from the release of Before Crisis, Ishimoto then worked on Last Order and Crisis Core, and these projects saw Uematsu's compositional work arranged by someone else for the first time in large proportions, at least outside of specifically created arrangement albums or reappearances of core themes like the Chocobo theme. It therefore wasn't too surprising to see Ishimoto appear as the composer and arranger of the Dissidia soundtracks, which would heavily feature arrangements of Final Fantasy tracks from throughout the years, and many of these were handled with great care. These soundtracks weren't just about arranging existing works though, as Ishimoto used the platform to compose some stellar original pieces of music, like the main Dissidia leitmotif and The Order That Must Be Protected from the first Dissidia, and Cantata Mortis and God in Fire from the second Dissidia. With Dissidia NT, there's actually a whole host of new arrangements for the tracks that featured in the older games, but this time around we also get to hear Ishimoto's take on music from Final Fantasy XIV and Tactics, and he's also thrown in a ton of arrangements of his own compositions that appeared in Final Fantasy Type 0, which are pretty awesome if you get the chance to listen to them. Third on our list is spin-off representation. If you were fortunate enough to play either of the original 2 Dissidia games, then you'll remember that they were strictly focused on the main series titles. And it made sense, as they were intended to be a celebration of Final Fantasy, and the main series is what most people are familiar with. But I always felt as though they missed a trick, especially with Dissidia Duodecim, as instead of expanding the roster to be more inclusive of other titles that people enjoy from the wider franchise, they just chose to add more characters from the main numbered titles. It's why I was incredibly excited when they announced towards the start of 2016 that Ramza from Final Fantasy Tactics would be joining the cast of characters. It showed that they were willing to branch out from outside of that solid base that they'd established, and this was further emphasized later in the year when they announced that Ace from Final Fantasy Type 0 would also be joining the cast of characters. I've been on tenterhooks ever since, hoping that they would announce more characters of a similar ilk like Caius Ballard, Pain, Genesis Rhapsodus, or even Nyx Ulrich. But alas, they've decided to instead focus on bolstering the roster of Dissidia NT with characters who appeared in the first 2 games. They've also said that unfortunately, Ramza and Ace are unlikely to feature in the story content in the base game, as they don't reside within Team Spiritus or Team Materia, but there's a possibility that that could change after the game's released. Either way, the inclusion of Ramza and Ace is still amazing, and I can't wait to play as both of them. Fourth on our list is the incredible summons that will appear. Now, summons have been an integral part of the Final Fantasy franchise for quite some time now, and they were also featured within the original 2 Dissidia games. However, this time around, they are much more prominent within the actual battles themselves. So far, there have been 7 summons announced, and they're all classics. We've got Ifrit, Shiva, Ramu, Odin, Leviathan, Alexander, and Bahamut. And before entering into each battle, you'll get to choose which one of them you'd like to appear. The major difference with summons in Dissidia NT compared to the previous Dissidia games though, is that once they're summoned, they actually join the battle and act like an additional member of your team for a short period of time. This makes them incredibly powerful, as by using them, you have the chance to turn the tide of the conflict pretty effectively. Outside of their involvement within the core experience, for Dissidia NT, they've also decided to add in a new gameplay mode called Summon Boss Battles, where you'll get the chance to square off these legendary beasts to prove your worth. And that leads us nicely onto our 5th item, the new gameplay modes that will feature in Dissidia NT. If you cast your minds back to the original 2 titles, you'll remember that they were pretty focused on 1 versus 1 combat. It was you and your selected character asking whether the AI or someone else via ad hoc multiplayer, whether they essentially wanted to take it outside and settle things. And this played out through either the game's story mode or the arcade mode or quick play. With Dissidia NT, they decided to shake things up quite a bit, with big changes to the core gameplay, but also through the addition of new modes. For starters, the combat is now 3 versus 3 by default, but you can still choose to fight 1v1 or 2v2, or even with handicaps if you're playing in a custom lobby. My main focus for this point though, is what you can do outside of the standard matches, and that's where the gameplay modes come to the forefront. First up, we have Core Battle, which was announced during a planned Dissidia livestream earlier this year. Whereas the normal mode is just a free-for-all versus, Core Battle gives you something to both protect and attack, and according to the game's director, Takeharu, they included this mode to give the game more of a MOBA feel. Although the objective is pretty simple in that you have to defeat the opponent's crystal, you can't just attack it at all times. If you're near your own crystal, you can create a shield, making it impossible to attack. The enemy must therefore defeat you before they're able to damage the crystal, giving the mode a clear ebb and flow. The second new mode is Summon Battle, an offline mode that's part of the game's story. As you progress, you'll get the chance to square off against each of the summons that we mentioned in the last point, in what Kujiraoka described as a mode that was super difficult to create. Next on our list is eSports. Now, even though the original games were geared towards PvP, and they were very clearly fighting games, they never really garnered much interest from the wider fighting community. There are of course numerous reasons for this, but with Dissidia NT, there has been a much more concerted effort from Square Enix to try and market the game as viable for esport competitions compared to the previous 2 games. It's seen them attend events like EVO 2017, where they held a panel to talk about Dissidia NT, but they've also been pushing themselves out into the fighting community. It's seen prominent websites like Shoryuken covering Dissidia NT, despite them never talking about either Dissidia or Dissidia Duodecim in the past. However, as they're quite new to the scene, Square Enix do realise that it might take them some time to gather some steam, and the game's producer Ichiro Hazama told our good friend Alex Donaldson earlier this year that for now, they're more focused on the idea of what the community wants and what it looks like the community desires. Still, Kujiraoka wants Dissidia NT to be seen as a standard and benchmark for 3v3 games moving forward, and he told Famitsu that they have ambitions to hold a global Dissidia tournament. And that leads on nicely to our next point, which is post-launch support. The team have been pretty consistent with their messaging that the launch of Dissidia NT is just another step in their continued improvements of the arcade version of Dissidia. Now you may not be aware of this, but since Dissidia Arcade launched in November 2015, the team have been consistently adding new characters to the roster, they've released new stages, and they've been providing updates that will generally balance the game better. And after the launch of Dissidia NT, they will continue to do this. And as they said during an interview at the 2017 Tokyo Game Show, their plan is to have the console and arcade versions of the game evolve together in parallel. However, they did slightly clarify this in their response to the next question they faced by saying that some elements may be added into the arcade version of the game slightly sooner than the console version, but they plan to have them on an almost identical release schedule. In terms of what we'll see and what we'll have to pay for, well, that's currently up for debate. At this moment in time, we know that there will be a season pass containing 6 additional characters, but they haven't yet said which 6 they will be. Now, based on recent comments by Hazama, we know that they're going to be working on characters who previously appeared in either the original Dissidia and Dissidia Duodecim, but haven't yet serviced in Dissidia NT. This means we're likely to see characters like Judge Gabranth, Tifa Lockhart and Laguna Noir all added into the game in the months that follow, but as I said, it's not confirmed at this point. I'd like to think that if they're making people pay to play as additional characters, that other elements like new stages will be free updates, but they could also choose to make some additional characters free as well. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see what they plan to do. One thing that they have spoken about is adding more story after the game's launch. As we already said, Ace and Ramza are unlikely to feature within the game's core story, but there's the possibility that the team will work on new sequences to help integrate the DLC characters into the conflict between Materia and Spiritus. Hazama told Finneland that he'd been speaking to Nomura about this very subject at 2 AM one morning. He said that while he can't promise anything, if Nomura says that that's what they should do, then they will strongly consider it. And last but not least on our list is the inclusion of Noctis Lucis Caelum. We've included this on the list because not only is it rather cool that Noctis will be playable in Dissidia NT, but also because it ended up being quite a drawn out saga, no thanks to the significant delays suffered by Final Fantasy 15. Now, even when the game was known as Final Fantasy Versus 13 and there was no release date in sight, Noctis was always a hugely popular character. It meant that when Dissidia Arcade was announced, there were already questions from the Japanese media about whether Noctis would appear in the game. And in response, Koji Iroha said that at that time they were already starting to think about adding Noctis in, but that they wouldn't be interested in adding him into the game until after the release of Final Fantasy 15, as they didn't feel it would be appropriate to do so beforehand. They were also trying to figure out exactly how they could implement his unique gameplay style into Dissidia, as he uses the Phantom Swords and warp mechanics. Final Fantasy 15 then obviously did release eventually, but there was no sign of Noctis until E3 2017 when he was accidentally announced by Amazon. This was soon retracted, but he was made official at the Tokyo Game Show a few months later to try and build hype before the January launch of Dissidia NT. Noctis appears as an assassin type, and by default he wields the Engine Blade, Drain Lance, the Two-Handed Sword, and Plunderers. They are each used depending on the type of attack that Noctis initiates. And as of the 11th of December, he was by far the most popular character in the arcade version of the game, with 11.3% of users playing as Noctis. Alright guys, so they were 8 reasons why I feel as though you should be psyched for the release of Dissidia NT. It's not long now, only a few weeks away, and there's the open beta starting soon too if you haven't already checked out the Japanese one. Let us know in the comments below why you're hyped for the release of Dissidia NT, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, we're starting off the new year with a bang, just like Square Enix, and that means there's going to be a big giveaway. So keep your eyes peeled for that video, which will hopefully be up pretty soon. We would also genuinely appreciate it if you considered becoming one of our Patreon supporters. Not only do you get exclusive giveaways, but you can also suggest video topics for us to cover, and you can receive one of these awesome badges. If you'd like to find out more, head over to patreon.com/ffunion. There's a link in the description below. These guys that you're seeing now have already chosen to support us, and they are awesome people. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I will see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.